Okay, now we're going to go over the passage about homelessness. At the top, though, I want you to annotate this title and kind of write on there what it makes you think before we read. So, always we look at the title of a passage before we read it to make a prediction about what we think it is about. So, I'm going to just ask a question. Is this passage about homeless people? Now, later on, I would come back and answer that question after I read the passage, but you can write kind of whatever this makes you think about, but it's always a good practice to start by looking at the title before we ever start reading so that we can make predictions about what the passage might be about. Okay, homelessness is an issue that affects people of every age from every country. So, people of every age from every country, there are homeless people in every age from every country. If you walk down the street in many big cities in the United States, you might notice people sleeping on the sidewalk or begging for food or money. These individuals are very visible. Now, for you, that word visible might be a little hard to understand, so let's make sure that we set that off, that we mark that. And visible to me makes me think of vision, so that would mean to me that these people are easy to see. These people are easy to see. I don't know if you can see that, but all right. These individuals are visible to passers-by, and it is difficult to ignore them. But there are also homeless people who do not sleep on the streets. So the people who do not sleep on the streets are different than the regular homeless people that we think of. They are not as visible to the public eye, but they are also homeless. These people often spend their nights sleeping in shelters, which provide food, rooms, and often a variety of social services like daycare. We might not see these people on the streets, but it does not mean that they aren't suffering. So this word suffering to me makes me think of like hurting or like suffering, like that they aren't sad. So just because what this all means in the first paragraph is essentially it introduces the topic about homelessness, but it also tells us that there's a different group of homeless people than we think of. And those are people who live in shelters, who don't necessarily live on the streets. But just because they're not living on the streets does not mean that they're not hurting or sad. Okay? Let's move on to the second paragraph. When thinking about homelessness, one of the first questions that might come to mind is, why are people homeless? People become homeless for a variety of reasons, often outside of their own personal control. Two key reasons have been identified on why people become homeless. The first, and I'm just going to number these here, is a lack of affordable housing. The second is poverty, or the condition of being poor. So now it has given us two reasons why people become homeless. The government is usually responsible for providing affordable housing to people and families in need. It builds large apartment buildings or housing developments for people who cannot afford to live elsewhere. Sometimes there is not enough affordable housing for all people who need it. Those who are unable to secure housing may become homeless. So I want to make sure that I note that the government is usually responsible for providing affordable housing to people and families in need. So the government then is taking care of those needs. Okay? Homelessness and poverty are quite clearly linked. And so I want to make sure I make a note of that poverty and homelessness are connected. Now, we know that that poverty is a group of people who often don't have the money to pay their bills, who often struggle to have simple needs filled, like shelter and clothing. So this first sentence is very clear that poverty and homelessness are connected. They are linked. Poor people must often choose between such important things as buying food or paying for medical care versus paying for rent. When poor people are faced with these difficult decisions, housing is often the first expense to be dropped because it generally requires the largest amount of money. So over here, I'm just going to write myself a note that usually housing is the first bill to be dropped. That housing is the first bill to usually be dropped. So when people can't pay their bills, the first thing that they let go of is their housing. And the reason is because it requires the largest amount of money. All right. So then many of the homeless in America are simply unable to find jobs due to a lack of opportunity. Others are mentally ill or addicted to drugs. Still others who are homeless have previously relied on public assistance but have lost that assistance for one reason or another. So I'm going to number the reasons then that once they lose their jobs, they are unable to find new jobs. So many of the homeless in America are simply unable to find jobs due to the lack of opportunity is the first reason. They're either mentally ill or addicted to drugs is the second. And they have previously relied on public assistance but have that assistance lost for one reason or another. That's the third reason. So make sure you note those things. Those are the three reasons that they tell us that they have a hard time finding jobs. An example of public assistance program is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which provides help for people who struggle to afford healthy and nutritious food. So this right here is an example of help. This is an example, of help, H-E-L-P. All right, there are three distinct kinds of homelessness. The first is called chronic homelessness, and it represents a group of people who move from shelter to shelter in a seemingly never-ending cycle. The chronically homeless are usually older, and they are often disabled or suffer from addiction. Okay, so this over here, I'm going to write chronic homelessness. That tells me all about chronic homelessness in that paragraph. Then the second paragraph here tells me about the second type of homelessness. So the second type of homelessness is called transitional. I'm going to write that over here. Transitional homelessness. Okay? Transitional homelessness. Transitional homelessness, the second type of homelessness is called transitional homelessness. It describes people who, here's the definition, people who must enter a shelter for a short period of time. That's the definition of transitional homelessness. For example, if they are evicted from their homes for not being able to pay the rent, they might go into a shelter or enter government-based transitional housing. They may live there for up to 2 years until they are able to get back on their feet. That's transitional homelessness. Here it tells me then the third kind is called episodic homelessness. So over here, where can I write that in the margin? Episodic homelessness. So I wrote that right over on the right-hand side, episodic homelessness. And that is the third kind here. Then it tells me the definition, which accounts for people who move in and out of shelters at various points throughout their life. So underline that definition. It tells me the definition of what episodic homelessness is. Those who experience episodic homelessness usually have difficulty maintaining steady employment. People who are considered transitionally homeless and those who are episodically homeless are often young. So over here, I'm going to underline that. The transitionally homeless and episodically homeless are often young. Homelessness rises when people are unable to find or keep jobs. But it also affects people who are not even employed in the first place. Children under 16 years old. According to a report in 2014 by the National Center on Family Homelessness, 1 in every 30 children experienced homelessness that year. As minors, children under 16 are not legally allowed to work. Most families that experience homelessness are made up of a mother and her children. Some adults in homeless families in the United States are working, yet the wages are often not enough to support the various needs of a family like health care, food, and shelter. Furthermore, many families try to stay out of shelters. Shelters can be noisy, overcrowded, and stressful places for both children and parents. These families would rather stay at home with friends or relatives or even sleep in their cars. Families that experience homelessness in any situation are under a ton of stress due to the lack of stability and privacy. So down here, I'm just going to write myself a note that families stay out of shelters because they are often, and the text tells us, that they are noisy and overcrowded. Okay. There's no simple solutions to this major social issue, but homelessness affects too many people around the world to be ignored. Okay, so I want to remind us that this really just informs us about homelessness and maybe the people who are affected by it and some of the issues that surround homelessness. It never provides a solution to curing the problem of homelessness in our country. So if you read back through the text, you'll find that it only tells us about the problem of homelessness and never offers a solution. I want us to be mindful as you read that. Make sure that your notes match mine, and then we will move on to the next section.